Good evening. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of HFA for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this very important webinar. We're going to be talking about the COVID-19 vaccine. We're going to be talking about it in general, and we'll also relate it specifically to the bleeding disorder community. We know that there have been lots of questions going around on social media and in chat rooms and among people just generally having questions about the vaccine. And so what we wanted to do here this evening is try to answer those questions for you all as best we can. As you're well aware, the landscape is changing rapidly. Every day there's something new we hear about. But one of HFA's guiding principles is to provide you with information that you need to answer your questions, and then you can take that information to your healthcare provider and have a more meaningful discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have a great panel here for you. Dr. Bobby Tran is an adult hematologist at Emory University in Atlanta. Kim Schafer is a family nurse practitioner at the University of California, Davis in Sacramento. We have Dr. Lisa Hensley, who is a Ph.D. She's the Associate Director, I'm going to read this because it's a lot, Associate Director of Science at the Office of the Chief Scientist, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Integrated Research Facility, and that's in Frederick, Maryland. Her background is in virology and epidemiology, and she also happens to be the mom of a son with hemophilia B. And then last but not least is Dr. Anne Rimoin. She is a professor of epidemiology at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health and Infectious Disease. So you can see we have a very, very experienced group of people here amassed to answer your questions. So I will remind you at the end again, but at the end of today's webinar, there will be you'll be asked to complete a survey and a brief evaluation. And we really do appreciate your feedback. That's what helps us be able to put these type of webinars on. If towards the end of the program, your questions have not been answered, you should feel free to type any additional questions you have in the chat room, and time permitting, we will try to answer those as well. So with that, I'm going to get started. The questions that we have really came from you all in the community. So these are questions that we've heard, questions that were submitted when the initial announcement went out on Facebook and other forms of social media. So these are the questions that were sent in. So thanks to Sanja and Anne, who did a lot to amass these questions. Many of them were duplicate. And so we are going to start with these questions and hope that you all get some answers that you've been looking for. So first, the first question is, how effective is the vaccine in preventing the virus? And will the current vaccine protect me against the new mutations? And I'm going to throw that to Dr. Hensley and Dr. Rimoin and see what they have to tell us.
Sure. Annie, do you want to cover the efficacy and I can handle the mutants?
Sure. Okay. So thank you. So right now what we're talking about are the mRNA vaccines. So the two vaccines that are currently licensed or have an EUA for use, an emergency use authorization to be able to be distributed here in the United States. These vaccines from the clinical trials are known to be somewhere around 95% effective at preventing clinical disease. And that's really clinical disease. This is 2 weeks after the second dose. It's really important to remember that, first of all, you don't have optimal immunity until you have both doses of this vaccine. For the Pfizer vaccine, the first dose, after the first dose, you end up with somewhere around 50% efficacy. And then after the second dose, it goes all the way up to 95%, but that's another week or so after that second dose. For Moderna, you can have potentially up to 80% efficacy after the first dose. And then another 14 days after your second dose, you should be somewhere up in the 94 to 95% efficacy. When we're talking about efficacy, we're talking about efficacy against clinical disease. What we don't know at this point is whether or not these vaccines prevent you from getting infected asymptomatically and still able to spread it to another person. So when we tell people that they'll be protected, what they're protected against is the likelihood of getting severe disease, having to be hospitalized, and all of the significant outcomes. Lisa, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I'll go ahead and take over with the mutants. So the second half of the question was how well these vaccines will perform against some of the new strains that we're seeing. And you'll hear them called mutants, you'll hear them called different strains, but what they are is there's changes that are accumulating in the viruses, and there's three predominant ones that we're following right now. One is referred to as the UK isolate, and you've probably heard quite a bit about this in the news about whether or not it's more transmissible, and this past week, whether it could potentially even be more virulent or more lethal. The other two are the South African and then the Brazilian, and the Brazilian one likely originated from the South African. So what I can tell you, and what the scientific community can tell you right now, is that when you take people who have had the vaccine and you take their blood and you look to see whether or not the antibodies in their blood will still recognize the UK isolate and prevent that virus from infecting cells in vitro, the answer is that yes, the current vaccines do appear to do that. In fact, we don't notice a difference in the levels when we're looking. Now, the question becomes the South African one, and there's more concern about the South African and the Brazilian one because we know that some of the monoclonal antibodies didn't work as well. So what we know right now is that for those two isolates, particularly the South African where there's the most data, it doesn't appear that the antibodies in people's blood who have had the vaccine work as well. They still work, but at a slightly reduced level. So there's good hope that the vaccine will still work, but we won't know for sure until we get into clinical trials or until we do additional monitoring. So this is a great point of reminding people that we have to be vigilant with transmission and also monitoring, looking for new variants, looking for new strains to occur so that we can continue to monitor the vaccine performance. And if need be, change that vaccine to better address the new variants. So I'll pause there to see if anybody else would like.
Anybody else want to add anything?
I just want to add one more thing that I think is really important, and this is something that Dr. Hensley knows quite a bit about because she's been. She also failed to mention that Dr. Hensley is actually an expert in coronaviruses. So she knows quite a bit about all of this. But one of the discussions that we've been having is really about this mRNA technology and the fact that yes, these viruses or these vaccines can be updated, but Dr. Hensley, as you were saying to me before, that this technology is really terrific because these vaccines can be updated quickly. And this technology really lends itself to being updated so that we won't be having to wait the same kind of lengthy period of time to have new vaccines, updated vaccines available.
Great, thank you very much. In our putting together the questions today, we left out one of the most important questions, and Sandra reminded me to please address this, and I think we all are on the same page, but many consumers within the bleeding disorder community are asking, should I even get this vaccine? Anybody want to comment on that? Oh, come on,
Sure.
somebody.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I can comment on that. So having a bleeding disorder alone does not put you at a higher risk. However, because the COVID infection is so variable, they're of a spectrum, those individuals that are having severe disease are ending up in the intensive care unit. And so at this point in time, it is recommended that if you don't have any contraindications to getting the vaccine, and once your group becomes able to get the vaccine, we are recommending that you do get it in order to help decrease the potential severity of the COVID infection if you should get it in the future. And I think that Dr. Rimoin, as well as Dr. Hensley, did a great job of mentioning that, you know, we still don't understand the transmissibility of this virus after the vaccine. And so even though you get the vaccine, we would still recommend that you wear masks as well as perform hand hygiene as well.
Great. Anybody else want to comment there?
Yeah, I'll just add on to Dr. Tran's point. The other thing we've been stressing, because we don't understand if the vaccine or how well the vaccines will prevent transmission, particularly as the virus might change a little bit, in addition to the things like the masking, the hand washing. The other question that I get quite a bit is, I've had the vaccine, can I now go visit my family? Are family gatherings okay? And we do really want to stress that because we don't understand this, just because you've had the vaccine doesn't mean you couldn't potentially put your family members at risk by unknowingly transmit the virus. So until everybody has had that vaccine in your family, we are still recommending that you avoid those family gatherings and you still wear your mask and you still take all the same precautions as you just heard.
Great. The next question, which was very popular, is people want to know what the side effects of the vaccine are. And I know we could do a whole webinar on the potential side effects, but if Dr. Hensley, if you would mind starting us off there.
Sure. Sure. Sorry, my audio cut out there. So I do want to encourage people. First off, I'll say there's a lot of bad information on the web or misinformation. So I'm going to go through some of the most common side effects, but most of the local and state health departments have links to the FDA information sheets. So if you have any questions, I strongly encourage you to go look at those sheets. But what might you expect? And when we talk about side effects, some of the milder ones that you might get would be injection site reactions, pain, tenderness, swelling in the lymph nodes. You might also feel fatigue, headache, muscle pain, joint pain. Some people have reported nausea, vomiting. You won't see it necessarily on the FDA website, but we're hearing a lot of reports of GI symptoms and some people having gastrointestinal diarrhea. There is also the potential for the more severe reactions. And I think that this is where people get very concerned. And this is the allergic reactions that we've heard about and the anaphylaxis. And this is where people who have a history of anaphylaxis or allergic responses want to be very careful. And I'm sure Dr. Tran has some comment he'd like to add here. But that's the one point that I do want to remind everybody is that every vaccine almost out there is the risk of severe adverse reactions. We see anaphylactic reactions with other vaccines. It may be that the rate is slightly higher with the Pfizer vaccine, but it's important to understand that the risks, it's still a very low risk and that can be properly managed, hopefully. And I'll ask Dr. Tran if he wants to talk here or jump in about people who might be at increased risk for severe adverse.
Sure, I can comment on that. So the COVID vaccine is being administered in multiple locations. And so just kind of understanding that certain locations are more equipped to respond to an anaphylactic reaction is very important to take into consideration. And so if, for example, you have a history of anaphylaxis, whether it's to factor product or to some other drug or medication, then it would be wise to sign up for a COVID vaccine administration in a facility that has the capabilities to respond to an urgent or anaphylactic reaction. For example, in a clinic near a hospital or possibly in a hospital would be an ideal location to get the medication administered. And of course, you know, as the other panelists, as one of the panelists here, I would also recommend that you talk to your primary care provider and also your local HTC as well, who knows your history a lot better than we do, and to run that by them to ensure that that's what they would recommend for you. Now, if there are certain vaccination sites, such as the grocery store or some of these drive-through clinics that also can administer the COVID vaccine. And if you have a history of anaphylaxis, I would not recommend that you go to these facilities to get the medication administered, because they have very limited capabilities of responding. They may have an EpiPen, the EpiPen or, you know, Benadryl, or they may have steroids as well. That may be able to hold you over until an ambulance can come. But again, you know, if response time is important, then we would recommend that you get it administered in a controlled setting like a clinic or a hospital, and then possibly be observed a little bit longer than the recommended time period as well, because allergic reactions can occur pretty quickly, but then it can occur up to 30 minutes to 45 minutes later as well.
Great. Very important information. The next question on our list was, and I'm going to give this to both Dr. Rimoin and Dr. Hensley. What's the difference between emergency use authorization of a vaccine and the traditional approval route that a vaccine takes? And then there's a follow-up question that goes along with this.
Dr. Hensley, you should answer this question because you actually have been at the FDA and are the perfect person to answer it.
Now I have to be a little faster with my unmute button. And it's correct, I did spend a year at FDA. So what is an EUA? And I know we're all learning all of these terms very quickly, but an EUA refers to an emergency use authorization. One, there is a crisis, be it an outbreak of a disease, a natural disaster. The Secretary of Health and Human Services can declare an emergency. When an emergency is declared by the Secretary, it allows certain things to happen. And one of those things is it allows the FDA to do what's called an emergency use authorization. And so an emergency use authorization sometimes, in my opinion, gets a bad rap because it's considered to be a lower bar. But I want to stress here, speaking to my colleagues at FDA, they do take the reviews quite seriously. But when can the FDA use an EUA? The first thing is an EUA, the emergency has to be declared. The second thing, there has to be a declared need. So there has to be a demand or something that needs to be addressed. And there also has to not be an existing treatment already approved that could be used for that. So what happens is that when there's a full review, there's often more data. You have to have a certain standard met with controlled trials. Because this is an emergency, the FDA recognizes you may not have the amount of time to do these trials, but there is such a demand or need to address a critical life-threatening situation that as long as you believe the therapy is safe and could potentially, and that is the big word here, could potentially have a benefit, that they will move it forward and give the indication that it could be used. Now, it's important to remember, once the emergency is declared over, that EUA disappears. And if a company or a group wants to keep a product on the market, they will have to go for the full regulatory approval. So you'll see when you go for your COVID vaccine, or if you're getting a drug, or even perhaps in some of the handouts for some of the diagnostics, it'll clearly say that this was, it's being done underneath the EUA. And some of them you may also see something where the evidence may be lower or some language. So that's the disclosure to you that a different standard was used. It does not mean that there is no data. And in fact, when you think about the EUAs for therapeutics versus vaccines, I really want to stress that for a therapeutic, you're treating somebody who has a disease. So there's a risk balance. When you move to the vaccine, we're giving that to a healthy person. So there had to be data that first indicated that the drug or the vaccine was safe, and that there was a belief that it would do good, that it would have benefit. And that data was independently reviewed by what we call a data safety and management board. So during the trial, there was an independent group of scientists who reviewed all of the data, but then it also went to FDA for an independent review. So the short answer is an EUA is a rapid way to move something to make it available to patients and to clinicians and public health measures, but that the evidence used to approve it is lower than what would be a full licensure. Annie or anybody else on the panel, would you like to add anything to that?
That's a great segue into the next question, which was, since these vaccines were developed so rapidly, what is the safety of the vaccine? Are these quickly developed vaccines safe? And I'll throw it back to you guys. Anne, if you want, or Dr.
Yeah,
I can start, and then Dr. Hensley can finish with this, because she actually has worked on all of this as well. But you know, I think that the key here is that these vaccines, even though that they came to you know, these for coronavirus, they were developed quickly. The technology has been something that has been being worked on for now almost 2 decades. And just because like using these for coronavirus specifically, it doesn't mean that this was a technology that hasn't been being considered for a very long time. It's a very safe technology, and there have been many other trials out there using mRNA technology, just for other viruses, for other things, that just not coronavirus. I think it's also really important to remember that, you know, even though these trials happened in a short period of time, the reason that this was called Operation Warp Speed, and the thing that really made it happen quickly, is that the government paid for the manufacture of these vaccines before we had the data, so that they could move very quickly from getting information on how safe and effective they were to the distribution. These trials were very well-powered trials, more than 40,000 people in each of these trials. There's a lot of data. And in fact, we're not done collecting data on the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. We're continuing to monitor these vaccines. And now there have been millions of people who have received these vaccines. And so we're really, you know, the information is becoming clearer and clearer. We're getting much more specificity about how well these vaccines work in populations, how very well tolerated they are, and how few safety signals we've been seeing. Dr. Hensley, you want to add on to that?
Sure, Annie. I think you covered most of it. I know it sounded that these mRNA vaccines came out of nowhere, and I think Annie has helped correct that. But the US government had a program through a group called DARPA, and it was a DEP program, so our taxpayer dollars. And the whole goal of that program was from pathogen identification to treatment or vaccine within 60 days. So we've been working, and they have funded quite a bit of the work on this technology. In 2017, I think there was about 17 different RNA vaccine studies that were, or RNA vaccines that were in clinical trials for various indications, cancer, infectious diseases. I do want to be transparent, though. One of the things that's different about how quickly we're moving is that we don't necessarily have all the data on long-term side effects. We're learning as we're going, and we're continuing to collect the data, as Annie mentioned. And also full transparency. Whenever a product comes to market, you're moving from a population that you studied, and now you're moving into a very diverse community. And there's no way to replicate the diversity of our population within a trial. So there's always the potential that something could come up or that could be identified that wasn't seen as a signal in the trial. And that's why the post-marketing that would happen even with a normal licensure, but also here, the surveillance that's happening. So you'll see that FDA has a hotline. If you get the vaccine and you have an adverse event and you don't feel like it was taken seriously, you can report it yourself. You can report it to the company. So I think that the most important thing is that these vaccines do, from all the data we're seeing, do appear to be safe, but that we do want to make sure that everybody plays a part in continuing to monitor this and to share that data with the companies and particularly with FDA so they can continue to monitor. Thank you.
Great, thanks to both of you. Our next question is, when it's our time to get the vaccine, where do we go? And I'll open that up to the whole panel.
Well, I can tell you just, it's going to be different. It's different in every country, or even it's different in every country, but it's different in every county and every state in the US. And so the best thing to be doing is to be checking with your local health department. But there are some programs that are starting to be developed to be able to help you figure out where to get vaccinated in your state. I think that there's going to be a lot more work on this in the near future. But the best thing that you can do right now is check with your local health department and see what tiers are being vaccinated, and there should be information on how you can find out how to get vaccinated through that.
Great. Kim, how about a real life experience? What are you seeing in California? You're living in one of the biggest states with a lot of patients, a lot of people who want to get vaccinated. What have you seen?
Our center was one of the first centers in the state to receive a large number of doses, and primarily it went to first-line healthcare workers. And then once that tier, there were sub-tiers for some of the other workers. So that included not only doctors and nurses, but housekeepers, any other types of lab personnel that were interacting or at risk, high risk for the disease, to get COVID. I think maybe everybody's heard on the news that it's been a little bit slow in California to get through. I think that the recommendation to check with your local county health department is wise. They're going to have the most up-to-date information. In California, at least up in Northern California, many of the healthcare systems are looking at the tiers and notifying their patients either through an electronic, what we call a MyChart, or some sort of electronic record to alert the patients who are eligible for the vaccine, to give them some directions and instructions on how to make an appointment for that. So, and in Southern California, although we haven't started mobilizing because we've had a huge surge over the past couple of months, we are working to mobilize rapid vaccination centers at large coliseums and baseball parks. And that one will take a few more weeks to get set up. And so what I've been recommending to my patients is, we have a conversation about whether they should be a candidate and what tier they might find themselves in based on their own health status. And then, as we said earlier in the program, I think it was Dr. Tran who mentioned it, maybe, I'm not sure. But if you do end up having some concerning potential side effects that you feel, may affect your ability to get the vaccine, then you should have a really good conversation with your primary care physician about where the best place to get your vaccine would be. because there will be many choices for the consumers to get a vaccine, and it'll be in your best interest to look at your own personal needs and make the decision that'll be best for you.
Okay, we're going to switch gears here, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about our bleeding disorder patients and questions that have come in specifically related to those people in the bleeding disorder community. So the first one being, does having a bleeding disorder bump me up in the eligibility list for COVID? And I think we've kind of touched on that, but if anybody wants to add any additional information, Kim, maybe?
Yeah, I've had this question come up several times during our telemedicine clinic visits or even a personal visit. And what I've been telling our bleeding disorders community is that if having a bleeding disorder in and of itself doesn't get you to go to the front of the line, but I recommend that you look at your whole health picture because you may have other underlying comorbidities that may be more concerning and that may put you up higher in the tier and place you in that one tier that may be at earlier than, than you may think you qualify for. So if you're a 25-year-old with a severe bleeding disorder, but you also have underlying moderate asthma, then that may be that you may be one person who might benefit from getting that vaccine earlier if you qualify for the tier. And I think you'll have to look at the county tiers to see what the definitions are for each county, because I believe it's different in each state.
Great, thanks for that. Dr. Tran, I think this one might be one that you want to address. This person writes in, a friend who is a healthcare provider was able to get vaccinated. And she told me that they asked if she had a bleeding disorder and as part of the screening process. And this person wants to know if they're honest and they tell that they have a bleeding disorder, are they going to get sent away as soon as they say that?
So the main reason I believe that that question is being asked, so it's not necessarily just limited to patients with bleeding disorders, but also any patients on blood thinners. So if an individual has clotting disorders, they are also on a blood thinner that puts them at a higher risk for bleeding. And so the route of administration is an intramuscular injection currently with the two mRNA vaccines that are available. And so being that they're intramuscular, the fact that there's a bleeding disorder history does not necessarily preclude you from getting this vaccine. They will likely require that you stay there and apply pressure longer, and they will monitor you for bleeding or bruising at the site. And so I know at least in the Georgia area, the typical monitoring for patients are about 15 minutes afterwards, whereas those that answer that they have either a bleeding disorder or they have some history of being on blood thinners, they're being watched for 30 minutes. My recommendation to patients is that they apply pressure and they hold pressure there for 30 minutes in order to help reduce the chances of bleeding into the muscle.
And in a follow-up to that, a large number of people questioned whether or not they could receive the COVID-19 vaccine subcutaneously.
So I think that as far as that question goes, we don't know the answer to that because that's not how it was studied in the studies. So in order to safely obtain an intramuscular vaccine, what we would recommend is you talk to your specific HCC to see what their recommendations are. I can tell you what our recommendations are here at Emory. And so what we recommend is those on Hemlibra or those that are infusing prophylactic factor 8 or factor 9 products. to infuse a dose in order to get yourself above 10%. So if you are a mild and your baseline level is 15%, then you would not need to necessarily infuse, but we would, again, still recommend that you apply continued pressure for the first 30 minutes. And so, so in order, I don't know if somebody else on the panel wants to answer that as far as getting the medication subcutaneously.
Dr. Hensley?
Sure. As Dr. Tran already mentioned, when you change the route of administration, we don't know if that will change how your body will respond to it. So it's a conversation, as he said, that you should have with the healthcare worker as well, with your HTC, your primary care, and also when you go for your vaccine. Right now, we don't have the data to say that it's not different. I can tell you when my son had all of his vaccines, his primary care doctor was adamant that they wanted to do them sub-Q. And I reached back to talk to some of the vaccine developers on this subject, and these were just the normal childhood. So again, if you're thinking about sub-Q, it's that risk balance of how much we don't know and how important it is to you to make sure that you get the efficacy from how it's been studied. So as Dr. Tran said, talk to your team and then make the decision that you need to.
Great. Another question that's come up particular to the bleeding disorder community is wanting to know if anyone has come up with a way to differentiate between local vaccine reaction and whether or not the vaccine is actually causing a bleed. Dr. Tran or Kim?
Yeah, I can start. It can be a little bit difficult at first to identify whether if you're having pain at the injection site after you receive the vaccine, if it's a bleed or if it's just a local reaction. And so in general, a local site reaction to a vaccine will cause some pain and some redness around the site and even some itching. And what I find in real practice, if I've had a patient receive an IM injection that turns into a muscle bleed, what really occurs after that we can kind of tell is that with a muscle bleed, the pain will continue to increase. And the area around the injection site can become really tense or tight, even after you rest it. So there are recommendations that, if you have pain at the site, you can apply some cold compress to make it feel a little bit better. But in general, if you receive the vaccine and you continue to have increased pain that's really getting pretty bad, then I would recommend that you check with your healthcare provider. In some circumstances, if you have some HTCs have access to a point of care ultrasound, and if there's a question about it, and you can get in quickly enough, we can certainly try to do an ultrasound around the deltoid muscle to see if there's some blood, and they can differentiate between swelling and blood at that point. So I'll let Dr. Tran continue.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what Kim has said, and it can be very difficult to differentiate. However, some of the strategies that I had discussed earlier, as far as if you are or your family member is a severe hemophilia patient or a severe von Willebrand disease patient, then you should infuse your medication prior to the injection. And so if you're on prophylaxis, then definitely consider changing your prophylactic day to the day that you're receiving the actual vaccination to kind of get the best bang for your buck. Now, besides the medication, what I had mentioned previously was also applying pressure. So applying pressure immediately after the injection also definitely helps promote some hemostasis as well. And so early hemostasis is very important. And so, trying to trying to apply that pressure. And potentially, you know, if you get home and your arm is still a little sore, you could potentially apply some ice as well. Now, we do know, at least from, and this is anecdotal, from speaking to some of my colleagues, as well as some of the other healthcare workers that have had the COVID vaccination, typically the second day, 24 hours later, their arm is a lot more sore. And so, so just be vigilant of that as well, and kind of look for the symptoms that Kim mentioned. If there's no swelling, or, you know, but there is pain, that may be part of the vaccine itself. And so I would just kind of keep an eye on it. And if there is a concern for a bleed, and you can't get into your HTC, or you can't really differentiate it, and it's on the weekend, then, you know, you can talk to your HTC prior to getting the vaccine. But I would consider giving yourself a treatment as a precaution. But again, you know, it is a known side effect that your arm can get more tender afterwards, after, you know, 24 hours from the period of the vaccine.
Great. We did just have one question come in through the chat that they're asking, you're saying applying pressure for 30 minutes after receiving the vaccine. They want to know if wrapping with Coban or an ACE bandage is sufficient. And
so the location that you're going to be getting the vaccine is in the deltoid. So trying to wrap it with Coban or an ACE bandage is not going to apply that much pressure. And so I would say use your fingers, or have someone else use their fingers and just apply pressure and just hold pressure there. Because, and you think 30 minutes is a long time, but if you answer that that you have a bleeding disorder, then they're going to keep you there for 30 minutes to observe yourself anyways. So play on your phone using the other hand, but then apply pressure using the other hand. So that's what I would recommend.
The two nurses on the panel are in total agreement. Coban is not an answer for pressure. You need to apply direct pressure. Our next question is, I've heard that COVID-19 vaccine is pegylated. Some of our clotting factor products are also pegylated. So what does this mean? Dr. Tran or Kim or Dr. Hensley, anyone want to take this one on?
So PEG is kind of an interesting thing. I didn't know about the PEG until I read more into both of the vaccines. So PEG stands for polyethylene glycol, and it's used in many products and also pharmaceutical products, and we're not really even aware of it. But for this particular vaccine, my understanding is that it's part of the lipid nanoparticle bubble. And it's used in both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine to stabilize the mRNA molecules in the vaccine. And so I've had a couple of patients ask me about the PEG and whether they would have a problem with it. And what I've been telling them is that if they've ever had an allergy to a PEG-related product, either through their factor or through a pharmaceutical agent that they've used, because they're found in antibiotics and laxatives and even antacids. So if they've had a suspected allergy to PEG, they should discuss it with their healthcare provider, what their risk would be for taking the vaccine with the PEG in it.
Anybody else want to add additional information? Okay, nice job, Kim. All right, the next question is, actually it's two questions that are pertinent to the research that's going on within the bleeding disorder community. So the first one is, are there any concerns for individuals who have taken part in gene therapy clinical trials with the adeno-associated vector, the ABV? Or protein engineered transgenes when you get this mRNA vaccine? So open that up to Dr. Hensley, if you want to take that one on.
Sure, unless somebody else on the panel would like to. I don't see anybody jumping off mute, so I guess that's mine. So let me just start off by saying there's a lot of vaccines that are in development. Right now, the only two that have an EUA are the RNA-based vaccines, but we're going to see some adeno-based platforms, some chimp ad, some ad5, some other platforms that are coming. The question is, if I have a vaccine, could it somehow prevent me from getting the AAV gene therapy? And the answer is there's no data to suggest that. So keep in mind, it's called AAV, stands for adeno-associated virus. This is actually a parvovirus. So it's actually even different than the adenoviruses that are being used for others. So these are different viruses. There no reason to believe that when my body saw the adeno platform or saw the mRNA platform, that it would make an antibody that would somehow make the gene therapy not work or not be delivered. So right now there is no data to suggest that or any concern that I have seen in any of the literature, but I'll open it up to the other panelists if they.
Yeah, so I would just echo what Dr. Hensley had mentioned, that currently, I think that it's fairly too new in order for us to make any final conclusions, but it should not necessarily preclude you from participating in any gene therapy studies. Now, with any of the current gene therapy studies, you do get tested for whatever particular virus capsid that they use for that particular study prior to actually getting into the study. Now, the exposure to these during your lifetime is, depending on the subtype, or can be anywhere from 20% all the way up to somewhere around like 50 to 60%. And so, whether you're getting that from this vaccine or from just your environmental factors, I think that it's unknown at this point in time.
So if folks are interested, on the WHO website, there's actually a list of all the different platforms that they're aware of, over 176 different vaccines in various stages of preclinical studies. So if you're concerned that I have not seen any of the AAVs move into advanced ones, again, keep in mind as we're developing the vaccines for various diseases, the goal is we want your immune system to target what we're putting into the vaccine. So in other words, for COVID, we want you to respond to the spike protein. The idea is hopefully you're not responding to the shell of the vaccine. There are some cases where you may, but this is one of the reasons that we look for unusual types where maybe you haven't seen them that frequently. So it'll be important to continue to monitor the data, to monitor the field. But right now, the platforms that we're seeing coming to market, at least there's no data to suggest that they would interfere with AAVs.
Great. Thank you very much. The next question that we have is one that's very specific to hemophilia, and I'm going to refer it to Dr. Tran. And it is it safe to get the vaccination if you are on Hemlibra?
So again, it's very new, but there is no data that is available that says being on Hemlibra should be a contraindication to getting this vaccine. At this point in time, again, we don't have enough data to say, I think one of the questions had mentioned whether or not there is a concern for inhibitor development. At this point in time, this has not been well studied, so we can't really comment on that question. But as far as Hemlibra goes, if you are injecting Hemlibra regularly, as everyone knows, the Hemlibra use essentially brings you up into a mild category for hemophilia. And so again, at our center, what we recommend is if patients are on Hemlibra regularly, that they do their Hemlibra as scheduled, and when their time comes for their vaccination, that they, again, just apply pressure a little bit longer than a an individual without a bleeding disorder. So again, that's what I would recommend that you do. And if you have any particular bleeding propensity, then make sure that you discuss it with your HTC prior to going to get the vaccine if your phases come up for you to get the vaccine.
And I think if there are any issues that come up, as Dr. Tran said, I think it's very important for you to be sure that you don't just disregard the issue you're having. You should be reporting it to your hemophilia treatment center team, because that's the only way we're going to be able to amass a body of knowledge about how this vaccine reacts, is by reporting those things that happen to your healthcare provider. So I just wanted to stress that to everyone listening, because I think that's very important, that we know what's happening. Even if it happens to you, you may think it's something insignificant, but if it happens to 15 people who are, say, for example, on Hemlibra and got the injection, and they all had a similar issue, 15 people is more important than just an isolated case. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Right, and Sue, one other thing, just in addition to reporting to your HTC and your doctors, you should also report the side effects to the, I believe it's the FDA as well, that the phone number that you'll be given at the time of your vaccination, make sure that you keep that around and that you report it to them, because they are collecting it nationwide as well. Great.
Our next question, as many of you know or are aware of, our patients with bleeding disorders were exposed to hepatitis C and hepatitis B many years ago. And so this question comes in and it says, is there any information on liver function and the liver function in hemophilia and the vaccine? Because many of our older members of the bleeding disorder community experience liver disease related to the blood supply. And this person is saying, if I understand the vaccine general process correctly, a good portion of the mRNA goes to the liver for construct. Any guidance on when to consult with an individual's hemophilia medical team when a history of HCV is present, or even post-HCV eradication therapy? So I'm going to give this one to Kim. She did a little bit of extra research on this for us.
Yeah, so this was a little bit of a tough one. I poured through the vaccine trials quickly for both. And what I found out was that for both the Moderna and the Pfizer studies, they didn't specifically look at the safety in patients with liver disease, because it was such a quick trial, and that wasn't the main purpose of it. However, and in fact, I think it really, people with liver disease accounted for maybe 0.6% of the total number of people in each of the studies. But having said that, there was no data to suggest that there would be any harm in people with chronic liver disease receiving the vaccine. So keep in mind that the current recommendations do advise that patients with chronic liver disease, including autoimmune hepatitis and those who have had post-liver transplants, should consider any of the available vaccines, and you have to take this risk versus benefit. So you have to take everything into consideration. But because there are differences in the types in each individual on the type of liver health that you might have in your history, I would recommend that you start the conversation with your hematologist early especially if you've been at a treatment center for a long time, because they know your history, and they can look at your individual picture, liver picture, and they can help you decide whether taking the vaccine would be to a benefit for you. The main concerns about patients maybe taking the vaccine would be the efficacy of the vaccine itself. And so it's a really good conversation to have with your physician.
Dr. Tran, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that if you have chronic liver issues or decompensated liver, I believe you should be following with a hepatologist as well. And so in addition to speaking to your HTC or your hematologist, I think that it would also be important to discuss that with your hepatologist or whoever's following you for your chronic liver disease, because they may have more insight and more imaging available to them as opposed to your hematologist if your hematologist is located in another facility. So I think it's definitely a multidisciplinary discussion that should be had if you have multiple ongoing medical issues.
And then I think we have time for one final question. And this question comes from someone who is interested about HIV. I would like to know if one of the two approved vaccinations is preferred over the other for individuals living with HIV/AIDS. Has one vaccine been studied more than the other in individuals living with HIV/AIDS? And I know Dr. Hensley did some extensive research into getting some numbers for us.
Sure, thank you. So great question. And of course, there's a lot of interest in this subject. I will say that when the original clinical studies were being developed, the Moderna one having HIV was originally an exclusion criteria. The clinical trials were changed so that having stable HIV was no longer an exclusion criteria. There were a small number of patients that were enrolled. The Pfizer trial had 120 people with HIV. They did enter the study late and therefore not included in the primary efficacy and safety analysis. The Moderna trial had 176 people with HIV. In that study, one HIV person in the placebo group and none in the vaccine group developed symptomatic COVID. Out of this very small number, there is no indications of unusual safety concerns that were reported for any of these people. Future studies, the J&J vaccine, Novavax, some of the other ones are including HIV individuals. So right now, what we can say is that there's no data to say one vaccine is better than the other, and that there's no data to suggest that there's a difference in adverse events and or efficacy of these platforms in persons with controlled HIV. Over. And so sorry, guys, my cat joined the call. I apologize if he's been distracting everybody during this. He only does it on conference calls. I'm so sorry, guys.
Nice distraction. So I think we've come to the end of our prepared questions, and I hope that we have answered a lot of the information and questions that those of you in the bleeding disorder community have had. I will encourage you to look back through the chat. HFA has been providing us with links to a lot of different websites and information that may be pertinent to you personally. But I think it's really good for all of us to take a look at some of these websites. And I just want to remind everybody that this website was intended to provide information to you so that you can make an informed decision with your own healthcare provider. I think this has been very informative. It's been informative for me as well. I'd like to thank our panelists for being available and doing the background research to get these questions answered for you all. And with that, I want to remind you that there is going to be an evaluation from HFA, and they will look at whether or not how beneficial this was. If you found this very beneficial, we may be having these again in the future. So again, thanks to everyone. They are going to compile this, and hopefully we will have some more information. And as I said at the very beginning, this landscape is changing by the day. And what we knew today is going to be very different than what we know a week from now and a month from now. And as more people get vaccinated, we're going to have more information about how this vaccine is affecting us. But again, just as Dr. Hensley said early on, just because you got the vaccine doesn't mean you can ignore hand washing, wearing a mask, and at least 6 foot distancing, and trying to stay within your own bubble that you've created. So with that, I'm going to say good night. Please take the time to do the evaluation. And I'm sorry to those of you whose questions you submitted in the chat that we did not get to this evening. Thanks. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
See you soon.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.